There's a loneliness more profound than being alone. It's the loneliness of being seen but not recognized, of being held but not understood, of speaking your truth and watching it fall into the silence between you and someone who loves the idea of you but doesn't quite grasp who you actually are. And here's what nobody tells you about that kind of loneliness. It makes solitude feel like sanctuary. You've felt it, haven't you? That moment when you realize you're editing yourself, not in big dramatic ways, but in the small, quiet ways that slowly hollow you out. You laugh at jokes that don't land for you. You minimize the things that matter most. You explain your thoughts 3 different ways, hoping one translation will finally bridge the gap. And somewhere in all that translating, all that softening, all that shape-shifting, you start to forget what your own voice sounds like at full volume. Being misunderstood in a relationship isn't about arguments or disagreements. It's subtler than that. It's the exhaustion of constantly clarifying yourself. It's the weight of being loved for who they think you are rather than who you actually are. It's the slow, creeping awareness that you're performing a version of yourself that fits more neatly into their understanding of the world. And then you're alone again. And it's quiet, but it's not that suffocating quiet you felt sitting next to someone who couldn't hear you. It's the quiet of finally exhaling, the quiet of not having to explain why that song moves you, or why you need the lights dim sometimes, or why certain conversations drain you while others fill you up. The quiet of being yourself without annotation. This is why being single starts to feel easier, not because you don't want connection, not because you've given up on love, but because you've tasted the particular bitterness of being lonely while lying next to someone. And once you know that flavor, once you understand that the deepest isolation isn't physical distance, but the chasm between how you experience the world and how someone else interprets your experience of it, you become protective of your solitude in a new way. You start to understand that being alone isn't the opposite of being loved. Sometimes it's the opposite of being erased. Let's be honest about what happens in those relationships where you're constantly misunderstood. You start to gaslight yourself, not in the dramatic textbook sense, but in the quiet, insidious way where you begin to question your own perceptions. They don't get why something hurt you, so maybe you're too sensitive. They can't see why you need what you need, so maybe you're asking for too much. They interpret your complexity as complication, your depth as difficulty, your truth as drama. And because you love them, or because you want to be loved, or because you're terrified of being alone, you start to believe their version of you more than your own. You shrink, you simplify, you become digestible. You trade your multitudes for their manageable image of who you should be. This is the violence that nobody names, the slow disappearance of yourself while your body is still in the room, the way you learn to prioritize their comfort over your authenticity, the way you stop bringing up the things that matter to you because you're tired of seeing that glazed-over look in their eyes, that subtle shift that tells you they're waiting for you to be done talking so they can return the conversation to familiar ground. You know what's interesting? The universe has a way of teaching us through contrast. Sometimes you have to experience what it feels like to be with someone who doesn't understand you to fully appreciate what it feels like to understand yourself. Sometimes you have to feel the weight of being unseen to realize how much you've been hiding. Sometimes you have to sit in the wrong connection to recognize what the right one would actually require. Because here's the truth that lives beneath this whole dynamic. Most people are walking around half asleep to themselves. They're not trying to misunderstand you. They're trying to understand you through the filter of their own unexamined patterns, their own unprocessed emotions, their own limited relationship with their inner world. They can only meet you as deeply as they've met themselves. Carl Jung said we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And he was right. When someone consistently misunderstands you, it's often not about you at all. It's about what they're not willing to see in themselves. Your depth threatens their surface-level existence. Your questions challenge their comfortable answers. Your emotional range makes them confront their own numbness. Your authenticity highlights their performance. And so they reshape you in their mind. They sand down your edges. They rewrite your narrative into something that fits their capacity to understand. Not because they're malicious, but because they're unconscious. Not because they don't care, but because they haven't done the work to expand their own awareness enough to hold space for someone as complex as you are. This is where the real pain lives, in recognizing that the person who claims to love you might not actually have the tools to see you. That love without awareness is just projection. That affection without understanding is just need. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and join a community of awakened souls walking the same journey of spiritual alignment. So you retreat into yourself, and at first it feels like defeat. It feels like proof that you're too much, too intense, too complicated, too different. You internalize their inability to understand you as evidence of your own unlovability. You think the problem is that you're difficult to love, when the actual problem is that you're trying to be loved by someone who hasn't learned to love themselves in their full, messy, complicated truth. But then something shifts. Time passes, the wound starts to heal, and you realize that being alone isn't the tragedy you thought it was. It's the return to yourself. It's the remembering of who you were before you started editing your existence to fit someone else's limited perception. You start to notice things, how much energy you have when you're not constantly translating yourself. How creative you become when you're not monitoring someone else's reactions to your thoughts. How alive you feel when you can follow your own rhythms without justification. How deeply you can rest when you're not performing ease for someone who mistakes your complexity for burden. Being single in this context isn't about being without a partner. It's about being with yourself in a way you couldn't be when you were trying to make yourself understandable to someone who wasn't willing to do the work of understanding. It's about reclaiming your internal landscape. It's about remembering that your depth isn't a design flaw. It's about recognizing that the right person won't make you feel like you need a translator. Here's what nobody tells you. The person who truly sees you won't make you feel seen through effort. You won't have to explain yourself into existence. You won't have to justify why you feel what you feel or need what you need. There will be a recognition, a resonance, an attunement that feels like coming home, not because you're the same, but because they've done their own work, because they've excavated their own depths, because they understand that loving someone means being curious about their inner world, not threatened by it. Think of it like this. Imagine you're a vast ocean, deep, mysterious, full of currents and creatures and pressure and beauty that exists at different depths. Now imagine someone who only wants to swim in the shallow end. They're content with the surface. They like the predictability of it. They're comfortable there. And every time you try to show them what exists in your depths, they get uncomfortable. They can't hold their breath that long. They don't want to dive. They don't see the point of exploring the parts of you that require more effort, more courage, more capacity to sit with the unknown. So you have two choices. You can stay in the shallow end with them, never accessing your own depths, slowly forgetting that you're an ocean at all. Or you can dive deep into yourself, alone, and remember your vastness. That's not a comfortable choice. It requires you to release the fantasy that love will come from someone shrinking themselves to match your depth. It requires you to stop abandoning yourself for the possibility of being chosen by someone who doesn't have the capacity to choose all of you. It requires you to believe that being fully yourself, unedited and unfiltered, is more important than being palatable. This is the spiritual lesson hidden in the pain of being misunderstood. You're being shown your own edges. You're being invited to stop collapsing into other people's limited perceptions of who you are. You're being called to stand in your own truth with such unwavering clarity that you become unmistakable. Not arrogant, not rigid, not closed off, but clear. rooted in your own knowing, unshakable in your own validity, willing to be alone rather than be half seen. Because here's what happens when you choose yourself. You stop attracting people who need you to be smaller. You stop resonating with relationships built on convenience rather than genuine connection. You start to emit a different frequency, one that says, I'm not interested in being understood by someone who isn't interested in understanding themselves. I'm not available for shallow love dressed up as commitment. I'm not settling for companionship that costs me my authenticity. And that frequency, it changes everything. Suddenly, being single doesn't feel like waiting. It feels like preparation. You're not marking time until someone comes along to complete you. You're cultivating the kind of relationship with yourself that makes you extremely selective about who gets access to your inner world. You're developing standards that aren't about superficial compatibility, but about depth of awareness, capacity for presence, willingness to meet you in your complexity without trying to simplify you. You start to see your aloneness as sacred, not in a martyred way, not in a defensive way, but in a way that honors how rare it is to truly know yourself. How precious it is to have your own company without the static of someone else's projections. How valuable it is to not have to modulate your energy to make someone else comfortable. This doesn't mean you stop wanting connection. It means you stop wanting connection at the cost of your soul. It means you'd rather be single and whole than partnered and fractured. It means you understand that the loneliest you'll ever be is in a relationship with someone who loves a version of you that doesn't quite exist. And here's where it gets interesting. When you truly embody this, when you genuinely become okay with being alone because you know it's better than being misunderstood, you stop radiating desperation. You stop performing. You stop contorting yourself into shapes that might be more attractive or more lovable or more acceptable. You just are. And in that simple state of being, without agenda, without the need to be chosen, you become magnetic in a completely different way. You attract people who are also doing the work, people who have also sat with themselves in the dark, people who understand that real intimacy isn't about merging into one person, but about two whole people choosing to be witnessed in their wholeness. People who don't need you to be easy because they've learned to navigate their own complexity and can therefore navigate yours. But even more than that, you become someone who can recognize real connection when it appears. You're not so hungry for validation that you mistake attention for understanding. You're not so starved for companionship that you accept breadcrumbs and call it a feast. You know what your depths feel like. You know what your truth sounds like. And when someone shows up who can actually meet you there, you'll know. Not because there's fireworks or drama or intensity, but because there's ease. Not the ease of shallow water, but the ease of being able to breathe at any depth. This is the gift hidden in the pain of being misunderstood. It's teaching you discernment. It's teaching you that your complexity isn't a burden someone has to endure, but a gift someone gets to discover. It's teaching you that you're not too much for the right person, you're exactly enough. And for the wrong person, you could shrink yourself down to nothing and still be too much because the issue was never your size, it was their capacity. So yes, being single feels easier than being misunderstood. Because it is easier. It's easier to be yourself without an audience that doesn't understand the performance. It's easier to honor your needs without having to justify them to someone who doesn't share them. It's easier to move through the world at your own pace without constantly checking if someone else is keeping up. But let's not romanticize being single as the end point. It's not about staying alone forever. It's about being so complete in your solitude that you never again settle for connection that asks you to betray yourself. It's about knowing the difference between someone who wants to understand you and someone who wants you to be more understandable. It's about waiting for the kind of love that doesn't require you to explain yourself into existence. And while you're waiting, while you're in this space of sacred solitude, you get to do the most important work. You get to fully meet yourself. You get to explore your own depths without someone else's comfort level determining how far down you can go. You get to discover what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually need, without the interference of someone else's interpretations. This is the transformation, from seeing your aloneness as evidence of your unlovability to seeing it as evidence of your unwillingness to compromise your essence, from experiencing your complexity as a burden to experiencing it as your signature. From feeling too much to realizing you feel exactly the right amount for someone who is awake enough to witness it. You're not difficult, you're deep, you're not too much, you're layered, you're not complicated, you're complete. And the person who is meant to love you won't need you to come with a manual. They'll be curious enough to explore, patient enough to listen, aware enough to recognize that your depths are where the most beautiful parts of you live. Until that person arrives, or until you decide that partnership isn't part of your path at all, you get to be here, fully yourself, unedited, unmistakable, at home in your own vast, mysterious, beautiful complexity, no longer performing for an audience that doesn't understand the language you're speaking, no longer shrinking to fit spaces that were never built to hold you, just you, in your fullness, in your truth, in your depth. And that's not loneliness, that's liberation. If any of this resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in these words, consider subscribing. Not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, but because you're part of a community that values depth over surface, truth over performance, authenticity over acceptance. This is where we gather those of us who have chosen ourselves, those of us who know that being single is better than being unseen, those of us who are waiting not for someone to complete us, but for someone brave enough to witness us in our completion. You're not alone in this, you're just selective. And that selectivity isn't a defense mechanism, it's wisdom. To celebrate your arrival, we've prepared a gift, a guide to help you navigate your inner transitions with clarity and elegance. Alignment, 7 phases of consciousness awakening. Download your copy from the link in the description.